I'm Professor Richard D. Wolff, and tonight we need to talk not just about what happened, but why it happened and what it reveals about the deep contradictions at the heart of global capitalism and American empire. So, yes, the headlines scream that China just struck America where it hurts most, cutting off key exports that the U.S. military depends on: rare earth minerals, advanced semiconductors, strategic metals, you name it. But if you think this is just a geopolitical chess move between two superpowers, you're missing the larger systemic picture. This isn't just a move on the board. This is a revelation of the economic rot within the American model itself. Let's be clear. The United States outsourced its industrial base over the past 40 years. Why? Because private capital, always seeking cheaper labor and higher profit margins, found it more efficient to produce abroad. Corporate America moved factories overseas, gutted unions, and sold the working class a lie that the U.S. could remain a post-industrial superpower doing finance, tech, and war while letting other nations make the actual goods. And now that very strategy has come home to roost. You see, the U.S. military, the most expensive and expansive war machine in human history, relies on components made in the very country it's trying to contain. It needs Chinese materials to build American weapons. Think about that contradiction for a moment. The empire is dependent on its economic rival for the tools of its own dominance. China, meanwhile, has slowly and strategically built an industrial base that isn't just cheap, it's essential. And now that the U.S. government is escalating economic warfare, tariffs, tech bans, military posturing, China is doing what any rational capitalist state would do in response, using its leverage. They're cutting off supply chains, weaponizing the very dependencies that U.S. corporations created out of greed and short-term thinking. So when people ask me, why is the U.S. military vulnerable? The answer is not Beijing. It's not Xi Jinping. It's the logic of capitalism, American capitalism, a system that rewards short-term profits for shareholders over long-term stability for the country, a system that deindustrialized Detroit and built up Shenzhen, a system that made billionaires in Silicon Valley while making the Pentagon beg foreign companies for crucial materials. Let's not forget, these are not just abstract policies. They are decisions made by boards of directors, backed by political parties on both sides of the aisle, and enforced through institutions that put capital above democracy, profit above people. China's recent decision to restrict the export of critical materials used in U.S. military manufacturing has sent shockwaves through Washington's strategic planning circles, and for good reason. This is not just another diplomatic spat or routine trade dispute. It is a calculated strike at the heart of America's military-industrial complex, revealing a dependency that few in power are willing to acknowledge publicly. The move targets rare earth elements, high-tech metals, and other essential components used in everything from fighter jets to missile guidance systems, the very materials that make the United States military machine function. When the world's largest manufacturing power pulls the plug on these supplies, it forces a sobering question: how did the most heavily funded military in history become so dependent on its primary geopolitical rival? The answer lies in a decades-long pattern of economic decisions rooted in the logic of profit maximization. Over the last 40 years, the U.S. corporate sector, with the support of successive governments, has aggressively outsourced industrial production in pursuit of cheap labor and higher returns. What was once made in Pennsylvania and Michigan is now produced in the Pearl River Delta. The rationale was simple: why pay American wages when you can exploit global ones? But this short-term economic gain came at a long-term strategic cost, one that is now becoming painfully evident. China, on the other hand, did not just welcome this industrial transfer, it strategically cultivated it through deliberate state planning, investment in manufacturing infrastructure, and tight control over resource extraction and export. China positioned itself not just as a low-cost producer, but as an indispensable node in global supply chains. Today, it controls over 80% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. These are not just obscure minerals buried in some geology journal. They are the essential building blocks of 21st century warfare, used in everything from satellite systems and drones to advanced radar and laser technologies. Without them, America's technological superiority is not just weakened, it's compromised. This isn't merely a supply chain disruption, it's a national security crisis that's been brewing in silence. For years, military analysts warned of this vulnerability, but their voices were drowned out by a chorus of economists and policymakers assuring the public that globalization would ensure peace, prosperity, and plenty. Now, with China turning off the tap, the consequences of that blind faith are unfolding in real time. The Pentagon finds itself in the bizarre position of relying on emergency stockpiles and scrambling for alternative suppliers, many of which simply don't exist at scale. It's akin to running a global empire on borrowed tools, and the lender just decided to collect. What makes this situation even more striking is the timing. China's move comes amid rising tensions in the South China Sea, escalating arms sales to Taiwan, and a growing US-led effort to isolate Chinese tech firms from global markets. This isn't just a trade policy shift, it's a form of geopolitical jiu-jitsu. Rather than matching America's military buildup with one of its own, China is using its economic leverage quietly, strategically, and with precision. It's demonstrating that in a globally entangled capitalist economy, control over production can be more powerful than control over weapons. The United States, for all its defense spending, nearly $900 billion annually, has overlooked a fundamental truth. Economic independence is the foundation of military strength. And in that regard, China has pulled ahead. The alarm bells now ringing in Washington are not just about minerals. They're about the collapse of an illusion, the belief that a nation can offload its manufacturing, neglect its industrial workforce, and still maintain imperial dominance. What China has just done is not just restrict exports, it has exposed the strategic fragility of an empire built on outsourced labor and supply chains controlled by others. In doing so, it has changed the terms of power in the revelation that the United States military depends heavily on foreign, specifically Chinese, components for its most advanced defense systems is not just a technical oversight. It is a strategic vulnerability of the highest order. In a world increasingly defined by geopolitical rivalry and economic warfare, the idea that the most powerful military force in human history cannot function without materials and technologies sourced from its principal adversary is both astonishing and alarming. This is not merely a matter of supply chain efficiency or global trade. It is a direct contradiction between military ambition and economic reality, and it reveals a deep structural weakness embedded in America's national security apparatus. For decades, policymakers have operated under the illusion that the U.S. could dominate the world militarily while outsourcing the manufacturing of the very components that make that domination possible. This illusion was carefully maintained through rhetoric about free markets, global cooperation, and the supposed inevitability of economic integration. Meanwhile, the real story unfolded far from the public eye. Defense contractors, faced with cost pressures and driven by the relentless pursuit of profit, turned to global suppliers, many of them in China, for cheaper parts, rare materials, and high precision manufacturing. What once required domestic infrastructure and a skilled industrial workforce was gradually handed over to a foreign power under the logic that cheaper always means better. But cheaper does not mean safer. And in matters of national defense, cost efficiency should never override strategic autonomy. When it comes to the advanced electronics, rare earth magnets, and specialized components used in F-35 fighter jets, missile guidance systems, naval radar, and satellite communications, the U.S. military finds itself frighteningly exposed. Some of the most sensitive and critical technologies used to project American power across the globe are built with materials that must pass through Chinese supply chains. This is not some hypothetical risk or abstract dependency. It is a concrete fact of how the U.S. war machine operates in the 21st century. The consequences of this dependency go far beyond economics. In a conflict scenario, even the threat of Chinese export restrictions could delay or disable key military capabilities. Think about that for a moment. The Pentagon may find itself unable to maintain or replenish crucial weapons systems because of a foreign policy decision made in Beijing. The entire notion of deterrence, so central to U.S. defense strategy, relies on the assumption that American military power can be deployed rapidly, effectively, and without obstruction. But what happens when a critical component fails and the replacement is stuck in a Chinese port? What happens when a missile guidance system needs a magnet that can only be refined in China and the export license is suddenly revoked? These are not theoretical scenarios. They are the new realities of globalized defense production. What's even more troubling is how long this vulnerability has been tolerated. Experts in the defense and intelligence communities have warned for years about the dangers of foreign dependence in military supply chains. Congressional reports have documented these risks. Pentagon task forces have issued urgent recommendations. Yet very little has changed. Why? Because the structural logic of capitalism continues to dominate decision making. Defense contractors are incentivized to maximize shareholder value, not to ensure national security resilience. Politicians are reluctant to challenge the very corporate interests that fund their campaigns, and so the dependency deepens and the threat grows. This isn't just a supply chain issue, it is a symptom of a deeper contradiction. The United States wants to maintain global military superiority while simultaneously surrendering economic sovereignty. It wants to confront China politically and militarily, even as it remains tethered to China economically. That contradiction is now becoming untenable. As China asserts greater control over critical exports, the U.S. must reckon with the fact that it no longer controls the full spectrum of tools required to sustain its global dominance. The empire's arsenal, it turns out, has foreign fingerprints all over it. This is not a matter of decoupling or Cold War posturing. It is a matter of strategic coherence. A nation cannot credibly claim to defend itself or assert global leadership when it relies on its rival to keep its weapons running. The cost of ignoring that truth is no longer abstract. It is real, it is dangerous, and it is now shaping the future of American power. The United States is now confronting the consequences of a decades-long economic strategy that prioritized short-term profit over long-term national resilience. What we are witnessing with China's export restrictions is not a sudden or unexpected crisis. It is the culmination of a deliberate process that systematically dismantled America's industrial foundation. For more than 40 years, corporate America, with bipartisan political backing, pursued a strategy of offshoring production to low-wage regions, particularly China, in order to slash labor costs, weaken organized labor at home, and maximize shareholder returns. The resulting deindustrialization wasn't a side effect, it was the plan. And now the same strategy that enriched a handful of corporations and hollowed out entire communities is revealing its cost in the most vital sector of all, national defense. The logic seemed compelling at the time. Why maintain expensive factories in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Michigan when similar products could be produced for a fraction of the cost in Shenzhen, Chengdu, or Guangzhou? Multinational corporations, driven by quarterly earnings reports and investor pressure, offshored production in waves, chasing cheaper inputs across the globe. Political leaders justified this by promising that the U.S. would transition to a post-industrial economy based on services, innovation, and finance. They told the public that this transformation would lift all boats, that the displaced workers would be retrained, and that the nation would remain strong through its technological edge. That was the fantasy. The reality, now undeniable, is that the erosion of America's manufacturing base has created a national vulnerability that no amount of software or Wall Street speculation can patch. Industrial capacity is not just about jobs or economic growth. It is about sovereignty. A country that cannot produce what it needs, especially in times of crisis, is no longer sovereign in any meaningful sense. And when it comes to military readiness, that truth becomes painfully clear. The U.S. once had the ability to design, manufacture, and supply every component of its defense systems domestically. That ability has been traded away for cheaper contracts and bigger dividends. This systemic outsourcing wasn't limited to basic manufacturing. It extended to high-tech components, rare earth processing, microelectronics, precision tooling, and even weapons systems. The very technologies that underpin America's global military posture are now entangled in supply chains that stretch across oceans and rely heavily on foreign, often strategic competitors. It is not just a question of where products are assembled, but of who controls the processes, the materials, and the intellectual property behind them. And in that equation, China has emerged not as a passive recipient of American industry, but as a calculated, long-term planner that used the influx of manufacturing investment to build its own comprehensive and independent capabilities. That's the hook few want to admit. While the U.S. was treating industry as a cost to be minimized, China was treating it as a pillar of national strength. Beijing offered subsidies, built infrastructure, protected key sectors, and strategically acquired control over resources. It did what any rational, long-term focused state would do in a world of strategic competition. Meanwhile, Washington celebrated deregulation, privatization, and market discipline as if they were ends in themselves. The result is that the U.S. military, the very symbol of national power, is now reliant on a global production system shaped by the very country it sees as a rival. This contradiction is not a fluke. It is the predictable outcome of an economic model that separates profit from national interest. The private firms that built this dependency were acting entirely rationally within the system they operate in. Their mandate is not to protect national security, it is to increase return on investment. If sourcing from China increases margins, they will do it. If closing a factory in Illinois and opening one in Southeast Asia pleases investors, that decision will be made. National security, workforce stability, and industrial independence are externalities, costs the system does not calculate until crisis strikes. And now that crisis has arrived. The deindustrialization of the United States was never just a matter of economic policy, it was a strategic gamble. And the bill for that gamble is coming due. The country that once built the arsenal of democracy during World War II is now struggling to secure the basic materials it needs to maintain its defense posture. It is not just an economic failure, it is a profound exposure of how market logic, left unchecked, can undermine even the most powerful institutions of national strength. The situation now confronting the United States, a military superpower dependent on foreign nations for critical defense components, is not a sudden mishap or external sabotage. It is the inevitable result of an economic system that rewards short-term profit over long-term stability. This moment, where geopolitical tensions have collided with supply chain fragility, lays bare one of the most profound contradictions of modern capitalism, the pursuit of maximum efficiency at the expense of strategic independence. What we are witnessing is not just a logistical or diplomatic failure, it is the systemic failure of a capitalist model that has consistently prioritized corporate earnings over national security and public interest. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that this vulnerability was not created in a vacuum. It was built piece by piece by a system that has come to value shareholder returns above all else. The business decisions that led to the outsourcing of U.S. industrial capacity, including the production of military technologies and strategic materials, were not made in secret. They were celebrated in boardrooms and on Wall Street. Every factory closed in the U.S. and relocated overseas boosted a stock price. Every supply chain optimized for cost cutting rather than resilience was hailed as innovation. And while these moves enriched a narrow class of investors and executives, they hollowed out the very structures on which national strength depends. This is the hook that rarely makes headlines. The vulnerability the United States now faces is not the result of hostile foreign policy by adversaries. It is the logical outcome of decisions made by its own economic elite under the rules of modern capitalism. Corporate executives are not tasked with considering the national interest. Their legal and financial obligations lie with maximizing shareholder value. If that means producing vital military components in countries with lower labor costs and weaker environmental regulations, even if those countries are geopolitical rivals, then so be it. And this has been the norm for decades. There was no serious national debate about the long-term implications. There was no strategic oversight preventing companies from relocating defense-related production to potentially hostile regions. In fact, it was encouraged under the banner of globalization and free trade. The irony is hard to miss. The most expensive and technologically advanced military in the world, funded by hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars annually, is being quietly undermined by the private sector's quest for profits. The Pentagon spends lavishly on weapons development, surveillance, cyber warfare, and global military bases, but it cannot dictate where the raw materials and components for those systems are sourced. That control lies not with military strategists or elected officials, but with transnational corporations whose priorities are governed by quarterly earnings reports and investor expectations. This disconnect is not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. Meanwhile, countries like China have taken a very different approach. They have built their economies around long-term planning, state support for strategic industries, and tight control over key resources. This isn't about ideology, it's about strategic clarity. While the US allowed market logic to dictate industrial policy, China treated industrial policy as a matter of national strength. The result is that when conflict arises, economic, technological, or military, China can respond with coordinated leverage. It can restrict exports of rare earths, slow the delivery of critical materials, and reassert control over its role in the global supply chain. The US, in contrast, finds itself scrambling, trying to undo decades of disinvestment and fragmentation in the name of resilience, a word now used by the very institutions that once championed deregulation and offshoring. This entire scenario demonstrates the fallacy at the heart of neoliberal economics, that market forces alone can be trusted to allocate resources efficiently and responsibly. In reality, markets are blind to long-term consequences when profit is immediate. National security, public welfare, environmental sustainability, none of these are priced into the equations that determine corporate behavior. And when you structure an economy around that principle, you shouldn't be surprised when even the most powerful state in the world is left exposed, unable to maintain its dominance without the permission of its economic rival. What this moment demands is not merely a policy correction, but a systemic re-evaluation of how national interests are defined, protected, and subordinated within our economic order, because as long as profit is the sole metric of success, the strategic vulnerabilities we now face will not only persist, they will deepen. So yes, China hit America where it hurts, but we need to go deeper. The real injury was self-inflicted. Decades of neoliberal economic policy made the US militarily dependent and economically vulnerable. And now, with that vulnerability exposed, the American ruling class wants to stoke fear, stir nationalism, and blame the Chinese threat instead of taking responsibility for the failure of a capitalist system that sold out its own workers and its own sovereignty. The path forward doesn't lie in more militarism or economic decoupling that punishes the poor on both sides of the Pacific. It lies in a radical rethinking of our economic priorities, reindustrialization based on worker control, investment in domestic production, not for profit, but for human need, and a foreign policy that emphasizes cooperation, not confrontation. Because unless we change the system, this won't be the last time America gets hit where it hurts. It will just be the beginning